Welcome everyone to Start, Sit, Stash, Quit Week 4. My name's Justin Boone, the lead fantasy analyst at theScore. We got 3 weeks in the books, but the most important part of the fantasy season, that's still ahead of us. So let's see if we can get you some help here, find some edges heading into this week's games, beginning with the starts for Week 4. And the very first start, we're going with a quarterback here, CJ Stroud versus the Jaguars. He's coming off 2 quieter fantasy performances. He went up against the Bears and the Vikings, but he is poised to rebound here versus the Jags this week. Jacksonville, they have injuries on defense. They just gave up a 4-touchdown game to Josh Allen in primetime. They're also on a short week. They had that Monday night game. And going back to last year, Stroud finished as a fantasy QB1 in both of his games against Jacksonville. This is a really nice bounce back spot for Stroud. You're going to want to make sure that he's in your lineup. For running backs, Brian Robinson at Arizona. We've already found out Austin Eckler, he's in concussion protocol. He is not going to play this week. Meanwhile, Arizona, one of the top 10 best matchups for fantasy running backs this year. They gave up 100 yards to James Cook in week 1, and then they gave up 100 yards and a touchdown to both of the Lions backs last week. David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs got there. So Robinson, RB18 in fantasy points per game on the year. I think he's got a good shot to finish in the top 12 running backs this week for fantasy. Over at receiver, Rashid Shaheed at the Falcons. He started the season with 2 really big games. I'm sure if he's on your team, you know that. Then he posted a complete 0 last week. So some people might be concerned. I don't think you should be. Shaheed still had 5 targets in that game. He's been over 20% for his target share 3 straight weeks now. That's something that he only did a couple times last year. Plus, I really like this matchup with the Falcons for him. It's indoor. We know he's a speedster, and he's gone for big games in 2 of his last 3 versus Atlanta. He had 65 and a touchdown in their last meeting and 95 in a touchdown back in 2022. So get ready for Shaheed to break the game open. He's going to have another big play this week. He is a strong wide receiver 3 for fantasy. Jumping over to tight ends, and this week, I think you got to go Jake Ferguson at the Giants. He came back from the knee injury last game. I was a little bit worried about him. Was he going to be 100%? He posted 6 for 95 against the Ravens. Now, part of that was due to the trailing game script, so I wouldn't expect those numbers every week. It's not going to be like that every game, but the Cowboys wide receivers, they've been pretty inconsistent behind CeeDee Lamb this year. Dallas needs Ferguson in this passing game. And don't forget, this is a guy who finished as the tight end 9 in fantasy points per game last year. With all the injuries at the tight end position, Ferguson actually a strong mid-range tight end 1 for fantasy in week 4. Let's move over to the sits now. And the very first sit, I feel bad about this one. It's somebody that I was very excited about before the season. Anthony Richardson going against the Steelers this week. He has struggled the last 2 weeks in fantasy and in real life. And more concerning is the rushing production hasn't quite been what we thought it was going to be over those last 2 weeks. Now he faces this Steelers defense. They're giving up the fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks this year. That makes Richardson a very hard sell this week. He's more of a QB2, so you might find a better option for week 4. For my sit at running back, Rachaad White versus the Eagles. White was a sit for me back in week 2, if you remember on this show. And back then, what did I recommend? I said you got to sell high before Bucky Irving eats into his role. Now, 3 weeks into the season, we've seen White struggle a ton. He's averaging just 2.1 yards per carry on the ground. He's only managed 58 scrimmage yards on 23 touches over the last 2 weeks. Meanwhile, his rookie teammate Irving averaging over 6 yards per carry. And their head coach, Todd Bowles, he said Irving deserves more snaps, that he's earned it. So White, more of a risky fantasy RB3 against the Eagles this week. My receiver to sit, it might be obvious here, but Jalen Waddle going against the Titans. We saw he struggled. The Dolphins offense as a whole struggled last week without Tua Tagovailoa. He's not going to be around for at least a few more weeks, maybe the rest of the season. Waddle just 4 catches for 26 yards in that game without Tua. Now, Skylar Thompson is back up. He's hurt. They're likely going to have to go to Tyler Huntley, who just signed with the team last week. Not sure if it can get any worse, but the Titans defense, they're allowing the 3rd fewest fantasy points to wide receivers. Until we see some positive signs here from Miami, I wouldn't trust Waddle in your lineup. And then finding a fantasy tight end to sit right now, it's a bit of a challenge. I mean, there's so many injuries at the position. It's tough to figure out who to stay away from. But Hunter Henry at the 49ers, he had that one big game a couple weeks ago in week 2. The numbers dipped back down last week. Now he gets the 49ers, who give up the fewest fantasy points to tight ends. So he's a clear sit. I would try to find a better streamer than Henry, but I wish everybody good luck out there finding a tight end that you actually feel good about starting in that back end tight end 1 range. It is really tough right now, so make sure you're checking out my updated rankings. You can see there who rounds out those top 12 tight ends for me this week. On to the stashes. This is the fun part. And Roschon Johnson, the Bears running back, just 9% rostered. There's no denying DeAndre Swift, he has struggled this season. No matter how much Matt Eberflus tries to tell us that the running game is, everybody involved and tries to spread the blame around there, Swift not getting it done. Roschon Johnson, he's somebody that they plan to turn to here. And he was inactive the first 2 games. Then they brought him in last week. He delivered 8 carries for 30 yards, 4 catches for 32 yards. And Jeremy Fowler at ESPN, he's reporting that the Bears plan to give Roschon an extended look against the Rams this week. The Bears' schedule coming up is pretty good. I still expect that this is going to be some sort of a frustrating committee, but it's worth stashing Roschon just to see if he can provide a spark to this backfield. We already know he can pass protect, so he could eat into Swift's lead back role. We could see him become a sneaky fantasy option in Chicago. I would grab Roschon now. Let's see if he's up to the job. And then, you could stash anybody, but I wanted to stash one more running back here. Kendre Miller on the Saints. And I hesitate because this one is kind of surprising, I guess, based on what we saw in the summer. Dennis Allen seemed disappointed in Miller just consistently. All the injuries, he hasn't been able to stay on the field for the Saints. He spent the first 4 weeks here on IR, but he's going to be eligible to return in week 5. And if Alvin Kamara ever misses time, and Alvin Kamara right now, a little bit banged up this week, we're not 100% sure he's going to play, Miller would be the right guy to step up. Jamal Williams, not a lead back there, more of a number 2 back. Miller has the juice to be Kamara's replacement, and Kamara missed practice on Wednesday with the hip and rib injuries. We'll see what happens the rest of the week. So I would grab Miller now. I would stash him in your IR spot. You could do that for 1 more week. And then let's see where things stand next week and whether he can actually challenge Jamal Williams for that number 2 job in New Orleans. That brings us to the quits, and this is the section I don't like, but there's a couple guys I think you can't give up on here. The first is Ezekiel Elliott on the Cowboys. He's got the name. He's 59% rostered somehow still. I know people are struggling to find running backs, but Zeke's usage every single week, it's been dropping. 51% of the snaps in week 1. 40% of the snaps in week 2, just 19% of the snaps in week 3, and his touches have also declined every single week. And it's clear the Cowboys don't see him as a major part of this backfield. They have Rico Dowdle leading the way right now. They're also working in guys like Deuce Vaughn. They're working in their fullback in the passing game. It's a mess for fantasy. Zeke is not going to find the fountain of youth anytime soon, so I think you can drop him, even though it is tough to drop a running back. And I think you could also drop Trevor Lawrence on the Jaguars, also 59% rostered right now. I had him in the sit spot for a couple weeks. I warned that he was nearing that drop territory. Now we're here. Lawrence hasn't topped 220 passing yards in a game this year. He's only accounted for 2 touchdowns in 3 outings. That is just brutal. The Jags seem out of rhythm. This team is going to struggle here for a while. And this is one of the reasons why I was highlighting Lawrence as a bust candidate before the season. We haven't seen him top 18 fantasy points per game in any of his 3 NFL seasons. So there are much better fantasy quarterbacks out there right now. Hopefully you have one of them. If not, I think you can find somebody better than Lawrence on the waiver wire. And I think we're pretty close to seeing Doug Peterson get fired. I think we're closer to that than we are to seeing Lawrence actually find his fantasy mojo. So let him go in favor of an upside RB or wide receiver. But that's all for Start, Sit, Stash, Quit this week. If you want more, you can find all my content for free over at theScore. You should also check out the Score Fantasy Football Podcast, which I host, and make sure you subscribe to theScore's YouTube channel so you're getting all of our awesome content every week.